Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is, about midnight on October 21st, a man wielding a knife lunged at a Border Patrol officer. The man was shot 4 times. Did you hear about this incident? Probably not. Certainly, no one outside the immediate area heard about it. That's because the incident took place not somewhere in Israel, where all incidents of this type are recorded and broadcast around the world, but it happened instead at the border crossing in Calexico, California, right in our own proverbial backyard, 120 miles east of San Diego, just across the border from Mexicali, Mexico. The reason the man was shot by the Border Patrol protection officer and subsequently died from his wounds should be obvious. People wielding knives and lunging at police, or anyone else for that matter, intend to injure or kill. And it's essential to stop these attackers immediately before they do their harm and people are killed. This incident did not make international headlines. There was no outcry, no rage for the poor guy, even after details emerged that we learned that he was on a bicycle and jumped off of it to perpetrate his attack, and that he was denied entry to the United States. And that was why he went on his rampage. Admit it, there's a double standard here. If this incident would have happened in Israel, voices around the world would be screaming about Israel murdering innocent people riding on their bikes. The very well-oiled Palestinian propaganda machine would have turned the truth upside down and convinced the world that the knife-wielding killer was actually the victim. These are some of the lies that we are told, and that we're told regularly, and actually even at the United Nations Security Council. The PAUM representative, Riyad al-Maliki, he told lies on October 22nd, right before the Security Council. In describing the tension between the Palestinians and Israel, he said this: "Our Palestinian people, particularly our children, are being killed, targeted by the Israeli occupation forces. They are denied fundamental right to life because of their national and religious identities. Their legitimate rejection of illegal occupation is being faced with killing and destruction. Incitements and provocation continue in Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary as the Temple Mount is known by Muslims, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque attacks, incitements by the Israeli extremists and officials against Palestinian civilians. Day after day, we watch this." And the Security Council believed every word. They gobbled up every untruth. When Israel's new ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, had his turn to speak, the damage was already done. This is a war where lies and false rumors are the ammunition of the propagandists. And Israel is losing bad, and it doesn't stop. If the Palestinians speak untruths and falsehoods, it's one thing. But when the message comes from the United States, it's something else entirely. On Monday, October 19th, 3 days before the UN Security Council heard from Maliki and Danon, Secretary of State John Kerry had this to say about Israel and the Palestinians. Quote, "Security and diplomacy go hand in hand. There is not a time for one and then the other. Really, there is an importance to both. We want to see calm restored, and we want to see the violence stop, and I think everybody in Israel and in the region would like to see both of these things happen." Kerry starts out fine, but then he makes a terrible mistake. Here's what he says: "We continue to urge everybody to exercise restraint and restraint from any kind of self-help in terms of violence, and Israel has every right in the world to protect its citizens, as it has been, from random acts of violence." I don't get it. And that's probably because the Secretary of State doesn't get it either. Can Israelis defend themselves or not? And why can't Israelis be vigilant and help fight the terror spreading throughout their country? That's what Nir Barkat, the mayor of Jerusalem, advised when he asked that citizens who are trained marksmen and have licenses and permits and weapons carry their weapons with them wherever they go. And what about the idea of restraint on both sides? Israel is showing great restraint, especially because there are people being attacked. The vast amount of Palestinians who've been injured during this terrorist spree were the terrorists themselves. They were injured or killed in the midst of the act of terror. Israel is killing terrorists, not innocent teenagers. This is not, as Kerry erroneously stated, a question of protection. This is a clear situation of self-defense. It baffles the mind that even now the United States is attempting to put forth an agenda of impartiality. How could the U.S. see things in such a warped manner as to confuse those who are the terrorists with those who are the victims? Why does the United States administration continue to persist in their desire to put both sides on an equal playing field? Sometimes a man's got to do what a man or woman has got to do. And shooting someone who wants to take your life is as correct and appropriate a response at the border between California and Mexico as it is in the clash between terrorist Palestinians and Israeli citizens. And yet, listen to this. Now, here is a tidbit that is really interesting. It speaks volumes about Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas's brother-in-law was just admitted to Assuta, a private hospital in Tel Aviv, to undergo heart surgery. The surgery was deemed essential and a matter of life and death. Last June, Abbas's wife had surgery in the very same hospital in Tel Aviv, Assuta. Even more interesting is that the head of Hezbollah's daughter, Ismail Haniyeh's daughter, a woman in her 20s, was brought to Israel in an emergency situation and admitted to Ichalov Hospital in Tel Aviv after a routine operation went wrong. That happened last year. Haniyeh's sister was treated in an Israeli hospital about 3 years ago when she had an emergency. And then most recently, for Haniyeh at least, only 6 months ago, his granddaughter was brought to Israel for care after an emergency. All of these cases were considered humanitarian acts. Despite all the care his family has received, despite all the care any Palestinian receives in Israeli medical institutions, at this very moment, Abbas is still on his high horse, shouting to all who will hear and listen that Israel is executing and murdering Palestinian children in cold blood. Ironic? Typical? I'm still undecided. There is definitely, clearly a disconnect, both in terms of double standards of messaging and in terms of reality. What these leaders think is important for their families, for them, it's do as I say, not do as I do. It's not simply about right and wrong. It's not about consistency or hypocrisy. It tells us the nature of people and the conflict. People and leaders do what is best for themselves when it's best for themselves. They really don't care about what will happen when everyone finds out about these facts and when they're disclosed. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column from U.S. News and World Report. It's by Mortimer B. Zuckerman and was published on October 23rd, 2015. The title of the column is Palestinian Lies. Flames of rhetoric must be doused in order to advance peace. Mort Zuckerman is the owner and publisher of U.S. News and World Report. This is a pleasant way of saying he's the big boss. He owns the magazine. He also owns and publishes the New York Daily News. His net worth is about $3 billion. He's one of the billionaires. In its heyday, U.S. News and World Report trailed just behind Time and Newsweek as one of America's greatest news magazines. It was more in-depth than Time, more in-depth than Newsweek. I always liked it. U.S. News and World Report was always the first one I would go to. Interestingly, it was also the first magazine to go online and stop its hard copy print publishing. Today, it's still making its mark, but today also there are far greater numbers of news magazines out there for people to read online. This piece deals with the lies and rhetoric spread by both sides, both Israel and the Palestinian Authority and their acolytes. Zuckerman has a thesis here. It says that lies will not bring about a solution. It will only bring about violence. Instead, they must sit down and talk so that there could be a greater chance of resolving the problems between Palestinians and Israelis. Here's how Zuckerman begins. It's harvest time for Palestinians and Israelis, but not for olives and grain. It's harvest time for generation of lies. He continues, the immediate charge of lying is unfortunate, but not a root cause. It's laid against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for suggesting that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem gave Hitler the idea of annihilating the Jews during World War II. Professor Meir Litvak at Tel Aviv University has denounced the speech as a lie and a disgrace. Other historians have said much the same thing in milder language. So has Isaac Herzog, the leader of the opposition in the Israeli parliament, and so has Netanyahu's own defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon. Zuckerman explains what he thinks and why he thinks Bibi was wrong, and after that he explains that the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, has been a, quote, a liar of a grand scale for years. Here's what he says. There are two things to say about this fracas. One, the critics are historically correct. Hitler had the idea of exterminating Jews before the odious Grand Mufti got into the business. Two, the response of critics is yet another demonstration of the genuine nature of democracy in Israel. No freedom of that kind exists for the Palestinians, who are led by President Mahmoud Abbas, whose term of office was supposed to end in January 2009. He's still there, and he has been a liar on a grand scale for years, with terrible consequences. He feels passionately that the occupation is a terrible injustice. Understood. The question is what he has done or not done to make a peaceful settlement possible. He has consistently made it less likely. Most of the rest of the piece shows how Abbas just keeps lying, especially the most recent lie about Israel taking over the Temple Mount and destroying Al-Aqsa, the mosque there. Zuckerman also shows how Arafat used to do the same thing. He would spread rumors that Israelis and Jews spread AIDS, the virus AIDS, or that they poisoned the water, killing Palestinian children. Zuckerman said, Palestinian schools don't teach coexistence. Instead, they indoctrinate and brainwash children to hate. Zuckerman then quotes the left-wing leaning Ari Shavit. He's an author and columnist from Haaretz, who says that both sides are marching away from one another, which is indeed a common goal. Zuckerman quotes Shavit saying the following. Now, instead of Israelis and Palestinians marching slowly toward a common future, as Shavit put it in the newspaper Haaretz, the Israelis and Palestinians are filling each other with fear. Shavit argues that this leaves no chance for a binational or multinational entity. If there were true leadership, the bloody conflict might be stopped. For just as volcanoes can erupt, suddenly they can also calm down. There is a solution that is not a one-state dynamic, and sooner or later this will sink into a quagmire of hatred, paranoia, and bloodshed, Shavit writes. Zuckerman then ends by asking if anything can be done. Quote, can anything be done now to advance peace for the sake of both communities? Certainly the flames of rhetoric must be doused and a pathway found to engage in dialogue with the best Palestinians through real international mediation. Alas, given the tough atmosphere between Netanyahu and the Obama administration and its underlying hostility to Israel, it is difficult to imagine that the White House can engage in an inspired, productive dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians, end quote. This is a lofty vision, a dream. Zuckerman is reaching way too high. He places his hopes on the U.S. administration, and that's probably a mistake. Second up is a column from opednews.com. It was published October 24th, 2015. Reprinted from Gush Shalom. It's entitled Weep, Beloved Country, and it's by Uri Avniri. Avneri is one of the founders of the peace movement in Israel. Uri Avneri is a longtime peace activist. Since 1948, he has advocated setting up a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Avneri is very upset by the Palestinian terror and by the deaths of Israelis. But he's also extremely upset by the violence against Palestinians, the beatings of terrorists who have been captured. But what upset him most was the lynching of an Eritrean asylum seeker. He was a foreigner, the Eritrean, who was mistaken for a terrorist. This is how Avneri starts. The barbaric treatment of wounded Palestinian assailants by an excited mob can somehow be understood, not excused, not condoned, but at least understood. We have a conflict that has already lasted more than 130 years. On both sides, several generations have been brought up in mutual hatred. Sometimes a small incident can pierce the darkness and reveal a frightening picture. This happened last Sunday in Beersheba, the capital of the Negev. The picture was frightening indeed. Avneri then goes through a historical history of the conflict itself. He delves into the history of the Temple Mount, from its destruction, from the temple's destruction until now. He explains the status quo concept on the Temple Mount. For instance, he says, to regulate things, something called the status quo was in place. When the Israeli army occupied East Jerusalem in 1967 Six-Day War, it was decided that the Temple Mount enclosure, though now under Israeli rule, would be run by Muslims under Jordanian jurisdiction. Why Jordan? Because Israel did not agree to Palestinian jurisdiction. Jews were allowed to enter the enclosure, but not pray there. Here's where Avneri is most poignant. He explains that the ugliest behavior of this conflict arose when Israelis murdered an Eritrean man seeking asylum in Israel named Haftom, who was on his way to update his papers. He was lynched by Israelis who thought he was a terrorist. Police and others tried to protect him, but failed. Avneri writes, but asylum seekers? They are almost universally hated. Why? Only because they are foreigners, non-Jews. Even the color of their skins cannot provide a full explanation. After all, we now have quite a number of dark-skinned Ethiopian Jews who are accepted as ours. The gruesome lynching of the dying Haftom was totally ugly, totally detestable. It could lead one to despair of Israel if it were not for an anonymous middle-aged bystander who returned to the scene 2 days later, retelling the story on TV, admitting that he could not sleep since then and weeping. Avneri articulated a very serious and troubling point that many Israelis felt. How could they have been driven to kill a foreigner? Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. There are 5 cartoons I want to discuss today. All of them deal with Syria in one form or another. 3 come from the Arabic press, originating in Lebanon, but also published in Egypt. 1 comes from the International Herald Tribune. And finally, the first one actually, is a cartoon from a U.S. newspaper. It's important to see what others are saying and writing about. The Arabic press is much closer to the conflict. Lebanon, where 3 of the cartoons come from, is actually on the border of Syria and is involved in the conflict because, after all, Hezbollah is from Lebanon. This first cartoon is by Ken Catalino. This cartoon was published on the website of U.S. News and World Report. The cartoon has 3 witches stirring a brew in a larger cauldron. The cauldron is called Syria, and the witches are Iran, the United States, and Russia. The U.S. says, let it simmer. Iran says, let it boil. Russia says, shut up and stir the pot. These few words literally encapsulate each of the country's point of view on Syria. The second cartoon is by Patrick Chipati. It was published in the International Herald Tribune and in the international edition of the New York Times on October 26, 2015. The cartoon depicts Putin flying a fighter jet. Balancing on the wings in a very precarious position is Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. In the background are minarets, mosques, destroyed buildings, and smoldering fire as they fly by. It's clear that the cartoonist is saying Russia is helping Assad bomb Syria. It's as simple as that. The next cartoon is by Stavro Javra. These are 2 cartoons in a row that he's done, 2 days in a row. He's a Lebanese cartoonist with a very biting sense of humor. In this cartoon, the word Syria is spelled out in blood. The letter Y is a hand, and the sleeve of the hand reads Russia. The 2 fingers make up the Y, which really symbolize the V for victory. The cartoonist is actually saying Russia is causing much bloodshed, but in the end, it will result in victory. The next cartoon is also by Stavro. It portrays Assad taking a selfie of himself in front of a portrait of the major powers who were meeting in Vienna talking about Syria. The 4 nations speaking were Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. They were all in Vienna talking about what to do about Syria itself. Assad was not part of the discussion, but in the selfie, Assad actually becomes part of the picture. The last cartoon is by Hassan Blibo. Russian rockets are bombing in Syria, very close to the border with Turkey. The cartoon says Aleppo on top. The rockets hit tents, and they are, of course, refugee tents. And the fallout from the rockets are people in tents exploding and falling all around. This is a very straightforward, uncomplicated cartoon saying Russia is bombing with their rockets and killing civilians. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. The Jewish world was up in arms when a handful of Arab countries proposed to UNESCO that the Western Wall be declared a Muslim holy site, because, of course, it's connected to the mosques up above. There was a huge blowback on this matter, and indeed the proposal was altered. The alteration was very significant, but the new proposal passed. But, and it's a big but, the new proposal says that the tomb of the patriarchs, which is known as Ma'arat HaMachpelah, which is in Hebron, in Hebron, and Rachel's tomb, Kever Rachel, in Beit Lechem, in Bethlehem, are holy Muslim sites. The status of these 2 sites had already been resolved as part of the peace agreements, and they are managed by Israel and shared. Throwing a UNESCO decision into the works will undoubtedly create a real change in status, and that change will cause serious strife and raise real possibilities of serious violence. In the end, this was a PR defeat for Israel, but the UNESCO and UNESCO's decision will affect no significant change in status. It will only, however, rile up people's fears and stoke the flames of hatred. One reason that this terror spree throughout Israel is so different than previous terror sprees is that the mainstream of Israelis and the press itself are taking notice to what's going on in the West Bank. Almost the entire population of Israel lives on the coastal plain from just north of Haifa to south of Tel Aviv. It's a very narrow strip of land. And in the past, I would say 2/3 of Israelis live in that small little area. In the past, Israelis living on the coastal plain did not take interest in any acts of terror perpetrated against settlers, whether they be stone throwings or stabbings or car attacks. They were on the West Bank. It didn't bother them. Terror against settlers only came into their field of vision if it was covered in the national news. There were websites that specifically informed those who cared about those events, like Arutz Sheva, to learn about what happened on the West Bank. The mainstream Israeli media, though, in general, did not cover the terror that took place there. If they did, it would be buried. For the mainstream media in Israel and the mainstream media in general, what happens in the West Bank to the settler population was not important. Or maybe they thought, at least mainstream Israelis thought, that settlers chose to live there and knew and accepted the risks. Last summer, there was one glaring exception to this. It was an almost ironclad law. It centered around the 3 boys that were kidnapped in the West Bank. When that tragedy struck the nation, the nation galvanized around the parents who lived in Israel proper. Now, once again, Israelis are showing concern and care for all other Israelis affected by terror and tragedy, regardless of their address. Finally, the RIA news agency, which is the Russian news agency, reported that President Assad is willing to stand for elections, making changes to the country's constitution after things calm down in Syria. and order is restored there. Part of the Russian-Syrian deal, in which Russia came to save Syria and Assad from ISIS and al-Qaeda, was exactly this: having Assad agree in principle to stepping down as president and holding elections. Assad, of course, believes that he will win an election when the time comes, and he's probably correct. Some observers of the Russian-Syrian collaboration assumed that the new elections meant that Assad would step down and not run. That is clearly not the case. Russia knows that they need Assad in place right now, at least, for no other reason than to keep Syrians united against ISIS and al-Qaeda. The heartening news is that a plan like this is in place and everyone is involved. Everyone is on board. Everyone, that is. That includes Russia, Syria, and Iran. The Russian leader was quoted in an article saying that, quote, Assad said that if the Syrian people consider it necessary, he would not be against taking part in presidential elections, unquote. In that part of the world, that's not hedging. It is a declaration of intent. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one picante piece of information. Did you know that, and I'm sure that you've noticed, that Abbas is referred to by several different names? He's called Mahmoud Abbas. That is his actual name. But he's also called Abu Mazen. In Arabic, a man is often referred to as the father of his oldest son. Abu in Arabic means father, like Av in Hebrew or Abba in Aramaic. So Abbas is called the father of Mazen, his oldest son. Having a son is a great honor in Islam. It is not dissimilar, by the way, to the similar situation that we have in Hebrew when we refer instead to the son of, not father of, but son of. We also see son of in Arabic. That reference in Arabic is referred to as ibn. Ibn means son in Arabic. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.